In the 13th century, the world trembled under one name, the Mongols. From the frozen plains of Mongolia to the deserts of Arabia, their banners carried the promise of conquest and the shadow of death. They were unstoppable. Empires that had stood for centuries crumbled like sandcastles before a storm. Cities burned, rivers ran red, and the world watched as an army of horsemen, born from the steppe, devoured civilizations whole. But every storm meets its mountain, and for the Mongols, that mountain would rise from the sands of Egypt, at a place called Ain Jalut. Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world, a city of poets, scholars and dreamers, had fallen. In 1258, the Mongols under Hulagu Khan stormed through its gates. They massacred hundreds of thousands. Libraries, filled with the knowledge of centuries, were thrown into the Tigris until the river ran black with ink. The Abbasid Caliph, the spiritual leader of Islam, was wrapped in a carpet and trampled to death by Mongol horses. The heart of the Islamic world had stopped beating. And fear spread like wildfire. To the west, Egypt watched in horror. The Mongols were coming, and no one had ever stopped them. Persia had fallen. Iraq had fallen. Syria was next. The message was clear: submit or be destroyed. But in Cairo, one man refused to bow. His name was Sultan ad-Din Qutuz. Qutuz wasn't born a king, he was born a slave. Like many of his warriors, Qutuz was one of the Mamluks, slave soldiers taken as boys from distant lands, the Caucasus, Central Asia, even the steppes themselves. They were bought, trained, and forged into warriors, disciplined, loyal, and fearless. For them, slavery was not humiliation, it was a path to power. The Mamluks were unlike any other army on earth. They were a brotherhood bound not by blood, but by purpose. They fought for honor, for Islam, and for one another. Under Qutuz, this army of former slaves would rise to become the shield of the Muslim world. When word reached Cairo that Baghdad had fallen, silence gripped the city. Mosques filled with weeping. Merchants whispered that the world was ending. Even scholars, those who once believed knowledge could tame the wild, had no answers. But Qutuz stood firm. He gathered his generals and said, "If we do not stand now, there will be no land left. Not for Islam. Not for anyone." This wasn't just a war for land, it was a war for existence. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, had crushed the Islamic world's greatest city and was now preparing to invade Egypt. He sent envoys to Cairo, men bearing silk scrolls sealed with the Mongol emblem. The message was cold and simple: submit, or be destroyed as Baghdad was destroyed. The court fell silent as the words were read aloud. Everyone waited for Qutuz to respond. Would he surrender, as so many others had done before him? Instead, he rose from his throne and gave an order that would echo through history. The Mongol envoys were seized, beheaded, and their heads hung from Cairo's gates. It was not just defiance, it was a declaration. Egypt would not kneel. But fate played its own hand. At that moment, far to the east, the great Khan Monka had died. Hulagu was forced to return to Mongolia to secure his claim. He left behind one of his most ruthless generals, Kitbuka Noyan, a Christian Mongol, and one of the most feared commanders in the empire. Kitbuka marched westward with tens of thousands of elite troops, Mongols, Armenians and Georgians, determined to crush Egypt and complete Hulagu's conquest. Qutuz knew that if he waited, Egypt would fall. He had to take the fight north, to meet the storm before it reached his gates. Among his generals was a man whose name would one day stand beside his own, Baibars al-Bundukdari, a fierce and cunning warrior.
Baibars had once been sold in the same slave markets as Qutuz. He was bold, fearless, and sometimes reckless, the perfect contrast to Qutuz's patience and strategy. Together they formed a balance, the mind and the sword. And so, in the summer of 1260, the Mamluk army rode north through the burning sands of Sinai, a tide of steel and faith, moving to meet history. By August, they reached Palestine, where the Mongols had already captured Damascus. The land was silent, villages abandoned, fields scorched. Everywhere the Mongol shadow loomed. Then, near the hills of Galilee, they found the perfect ground for battle. A narrow valley known as Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath. Baibars saw it immediately. The slopes, the hills, the tight passage. It was ideal for an ambush. The Mongols, known for their lightning mobility, would be trapped where their horses couldn't maneuver freely. He turned to Qutuz and said, "Here, we will stop them." At dawn on September 3rd, 1260, the air was thick with tension. Two of the most formidable armies in history faced each other across the valley. The Mongols were confident. They had never lost a major battle. Their reputation alone had broken empires. But the Mamluks were ready. They had spent years mastering the very tactics the Mongols prided themselves on: feigned retreats, horse archery, and encirclement. And now, they would use those tactics against their masters. Baibars led a small detachment forward. They charged, shot volleys of arrows, then retreated as if broken. Kitbuka took the bait. He roared for his men to pursue, believing victory was at hand. The ground thundered as the Mongol cavalry stormed into the valley. Then a horn sounded, deep, echoing, ancient. From both sides, the Mamluk cavalry erupted from the hills. Thousands of horses charged down, arrows raining from above. The Mongols were surrounded. The valley that had seemed so narrow now became their tomb. For the first time, the Mongols found themselves fighting an enemy who could match their speed, their tactics, and their fury. The Mamluks were not merely imitating, they had perfected the art. Their coordination was their secret weapon. Drums and horns carried orders across the chaos. Each unit moved like part of a living organism, retreating, flanking, striking in perfect rhythm. The Mongols tried to regroup, to form their deadly wedge formation, but every attempt was broken by precision counterattacks. And then, Qutuz himself entered the fray. He tore off his helmet, revealing his face to his men, and shouted, "Wa Islama! Oh, for Islam!" The cry spread through the ranks like fire. Every Mamluk who heard it fought with renewed fury. The battlefield became a storm of dust, steel, and faith. Qutuz led the charge himself, cutting through Mongol lines. Kitbuka's forces began to falter, their horses exhausted, their formations broken. Still, Kitbuka refused to yield. He fought to the end, shouting, "100 of my men are worth 1,000 of yours." But even the bravest warrior cannot fight when the ground itself betrays him. Surrounded and overwhelmed, Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mongols, the terror of the world, had been defeated.
When the dust settled over Ain Jalut, silence returned to the valley. The bodies of men and horses lay scattered across the earth, and for the first time in over half a century, the Mongol advance had been stopped. It wasn't just a military victory, it was a psychological one. The myth of Mongol invincibility was shattered. Across the Muslim world, mosques filled with prayers of gratitude. In distant lands, Kings and generals whispered the news in disbelief. The unstoppable had been stopped. But victory came with a price. On their journey back to Cairo, Qutuz was assassinated, betrayed by rivals within his own camp. The sword that had saved Egypt fell silent, yet his legacy lived on. Baibars, his trusted general, would become the next sultan, and under his rule, the Mamluks would rise to new heights, defending the Middle East from both Mongols and Crusaders alike. Ain Jalut was not just a battle. It was the rebirth of an empire, and the beginning of the end for Mongol expansion into the West. For historians, Ain Jalut stands as a turning point, a moment when courage, strategy, and unity triumphed over fear. It wasn't sheer power that saved Egypt. It was intelligence, discipline, and the will to fight for something greater than life itself. The Mongols learned that day, you can conquer lands, burn cities, and crush armies, but you can never conquer a people who refuse to surrender their soul. The echoes of that battle still linger in the winds of Galilee. If you walk there today, you can almost hear the thunder of hooves, the clash of swords, the cry of "Wise Lama," carried on the breeze. The Battle of Ain Jalut was more than a clash of armies. It was the moment when history held its breath and chose to change course. Because sometimes it takes the courage of the forgotten, the strength of the enslaved, to remind the world that freedom, once earned, can never be taken. If the Mamluks were the wall that stopped the Mongols, then who built the foundation beneath it? A century earlier, one man united faith, strategy, and wisdom. The legendary Saladin. Subscribe for the next video, where we uncover the untold genius of Saladin and how his vision shaped empires. Because history has never been this alive.